All right, welcome to another episode of Beyond the Noise, Signals, Stories, and Spicy Takes, the show where we dig into the stories of the people shaping the future of app-based computing with a special focus on mobile. I'm your host, Matt Klein, co-founder and CTO of Bitdrift, as well as the founder of Envoy. And in each episode, we'll talk with engineers, founders, and technical leaders who've transformed the way their companies build and understand what's happening inside their systems. We'll dig into the challenges, the breakthroughs, the lessons learned, and we'll wrap it all up with their hottest takes. So let's dive in. Today, I'm thrilled to have with us Phil Rabin, who's the engineering director at SoFi Technologies, a fintech company in San Francisco. He leads the Foundations org, which focuses on mobile and front-end web platforms. He has made a career of working on scaling client technologies and building platform engineering teams for large consumer apps. He spent 10 years at Uber, where he built the first mobile web app and native Android mobile applications. And he also founded mobile platform teams for both Rides and Uber Eats. Fantastic. Thank you, Phil, for joining us.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. You have a fantastic background, and how I typically start the episode is would love to just learn a little bit more about you, how you got into engineering. Would love to learn a little more about what got you into mobile and front end development and what excites you about it.
Sure. Yeah, I can start right from the beginning. I mean, I've been into computers since the 90s, so when I was in high school. And I built my first website, I think, in probably like 96 or 97, back when the web was just, pretty
So did I.
static.
So did
Yeah.
I. Yes,
It was
I
pretty
remember that
cool.
time.
I
Yeah,
ran my own
yeah,
little like web server on
yeah.
my, like home computer, built kind of websites for my friends. And I really got into Flash development. And I was really into like kind of the more creative aspects of kind of front end development. I mean, Flash really blew my mind. I was into like HTML, but then when Flash came out, I was like, that's all I did pretty much was Flash development. I thought
There was that time period, I feel like in the late 90s, early 2000s, when everyone started building every website with Flash. I
it
think
was
I also
light
did
years
that.
ahead. Yeah,
Yeah.
the just the difference of what you could do, it was pretty advanced for its day, like full vector, full animations, interactive. You had music, embedding. You could do all the scripting.
Yeah.
It was
Well,
like
I was gonna
really
say
cool thing.
we're like totally dating ourselves now, but
Yeah,
what is the language that you wrote in Flash? I can't actually remember the
ActionScript.
name. ActionScript. And
Yeah,
I remember was a pretty good language actually for the time.
it's
Like you could
JavaScript.
do you could
Yeah,
do
it's just
yeah, you could
ECMAScript.
do all
Yeah.
kinds of stuff. Right.
Yeah, and it had
Anyway,
interop
sorry.
with JavaScript as well. I mean,
Yeah.
you could bridge the code to your browser, and you could do asynchronous stuff, and you could do RTMP and live streaming, gaming. It was a really powerful platform, and
Yeah.
I think for anyone who was like into more creative stuff, it was just like
Right.
a huge unlock that you just couldn't do on the web. When really you just had like, I remember having animated GIFs, and I thought that was the coolest thing ever. And that was pretty much, and maybe like, some of the marquee effects that you could have. That was pretty much in some rotation, but otherwise there wasn't much you could do back then
Yeah.
on HTML.
Cool. All right. Sorry. Keep going.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess I went into computer science back in, I guess, year 2000. I had kind of a really kind of like windy way. I did a few years of my computer science degree, and like a lot of people in tech kind of like dropped out of the computer science program. And mostly because it wasn't interactive enough for me. I was really like into my front end development. And back in the 90s, it was really like, it was working on like Sun Microsystems machines. And I thought the program was pretty dry. So I actually I finished with an arts degree and did a hard pivot. But the thing that never stopped was actually me doing web development and building my own websites and doing like
Okay.
work.
Yeah,
So actually,
fantastic.
when I dropped out of computer science, I actually started doing more of my own stuff. But then I actually went back and did a postgraduate. So like the through line is that, it was a windy path to get where I was going. And I think after the dot-com crash, there were so many people kind of like leaving the industry, and it felt like the bubble had burst and there wasn't really going to be much employment. So there was a weird moment there when 2004, 5, 6, where it seemed like things were kind of like dried up employment wise. But, I kind of like found my way back into the industry kind of like on my own terms. It just not like it is today where you have, the computer science programs and master's programs and everything kind of funnels into these, into these internship programs. I grew up in Canada, and there wasn't really any of that going on. It was kind
Yeah.
of fend for yourself, figure it out yourself. There wasn't even like websites really to learn this stuff. You had to like, poke around with books and trial and error and kind of experiment yourself. I mean, it was really like the new frontier. Yeah, totally different scene than it is today.
I
Yeah.
know. I think many people who are listening, which is weird to me because it makes us feel old. We're probably about the same age, and it's hard to imagine. I think for people that there wasn't an internet that you just could learn whatever you want. It's like you had to go to the bookstore and get a book on computer programming,
Yeah,
or
and I
I
had a
mean
couple
that was
neighbors.
the only way that there was basically.
Yeah, and in high school, I had a couple of neighbors. One guy was just a computer guy, and then the other dude was more of a hardware guy. And I would go over to their house and just like bang on the door and be like, "Hey, teach
Yeah,
me stuff. What do you know?" And I think what they know, like what they knew compared to what most people know today, was still probably pretty limited. They were just scratching the surface of this
sure.
stuff. It's a
Yeah,
lot like working with the command line or like working with like old, basic Windows, early Windows machines. And we had like an old Mac that we poked around on. So it
yeah.
was, yeah, it was less formal than it is today. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Anyway, all right. So you were dabbling in front
Yeah.
end development, and then
Yeah,
what?
and then my first job I got was actually really, really cool. It was for the CBC, which is the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, which is like the BBC of Canada, or like NPR here. I had an opportunity to join the team, and we built kind of one of Canada's first digital music streaming services. It was
Oh, wow.
probably,
All
I mean, it
right.
was like what
Yeah.
SoundCloud or Spotify was, what they are today. We were actually ahead of them. We had like real live streaming, actually hosted radio with streaming shows. And then we had a basically self-serve database where artists could upload their own music. And then we would source that music for the live streams, and you could create playlists and,
So you're saying that the government of Canada could have been Spotify? Is
yeah,
that what
I
you're
mean,
saying?
I remember even when SoundCloud came out, we're like, oh, cool. Like they did a really good job on this, like we were already off to the races, and, Spotify
Yeah.
came like much later.
Yeah.
And yeah, we were just like kind of ahead of the game. But again, we were like really kind of an experimental group of people. Like I was doing mostly front end development there. And I remember when like XHR came out, and, I could do like async programming. And then I was kind of like doing a lot of stuff with like Flash for the streaming part, and connecting that into basically, this was Ajax pages before there was really any frameworks around this stuff. Like
Right.
I'm forgetting the name of the framework, but it was before jQuery. Prototype. Yeah, and Prototype JS came out, and that kind of smoothed stuff out. And that was like that was really exciting when Prototype came out. But I think this was like back in like 2005 and 6.
Right.
I remember we're doing kind of like hacks on IE6 and IE5, trying to get it to like behave, because like it couldn't handle redraws very well. And so there's all these tricks to try to like nudge the browser, and then doing a lot of stuff with like kind of like bridging to Flash, and trying to get that like single page web app before the technologies really existed. So it's super fun. I mean, I think we built a pretty cool like service
Nice.
there.
Yeah.
Lots of Canadian bands were on it. I mean, like, Arcade Fire or whatever, like, they would come into the office. It was kind of like, tiny desk feel, where we had live shows in the office. And it was kind of my first taste of building something that was, cool with technology, like that, like, people outside of my own friend circle, like really liked, and we
For
built
sure.
something
Yeah.
meaningful. Yeah. And then after that, I kind of went to another kind of tech company in Vancouver. It was a kind of a marketing tech company, not that interesting, but at least I got my exposure into management. They kind of like promoted me very quickly. So by the time I was like 28 years old, I was like, already managing, and we're building kind of like, I think it's more enterprisey stuff, but it kind of got me exposure into like working with like a larger group of people, larger teams. And then in 2011, I ended up getting recruited for a company in San Francisco. And yeah, I was kind of manifested that. I was kind of really hoping to get down to SF, and kind of sent the vibes through the airwaves. And somehow, I got tapped by a company called Prism Skylabs, which was doing like computer vision software for camera systems. It was actually a pretty cool product.
Okay.
Of course, like most startups, it kind of imploded.
And sorry, for that company, you were still doing front end. dev
Yeah,
at
yeah,
that point?
totally. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
been my entire career has been front end web development. I've always done like full stack, back end development.
Yeah.
It really just like whatever I got to do on the back end to like get to the front end. But my passions were always in front end development. Anything that's client facing. I mean, I did like Silverlight development as well. That was the Vancouver shop. We were a big like Silverlight product. So that's kind of cool. Got some exposure there, which is kind of
Yeah.
like
I
the
I mean,
.NET stack. Yeah.
I was gonna ask, like, you definitely came up during the time where there obviously there was no iPhone, right? Or there was no Android, you know? So I
Right.
mean, you saw the migration firsthand, you know, from where everything is web first to over time. Obviously, we'll get to your current company soon, but now obviously the world is moving to a mobile first world. And actually, I just love to learn from you a bit around what I don't know, like what was it like seeing that transition,
Yeah, yeah,
right? Or
that's super interesting from the front end perspective because like, you got so used to building for big displays, having headers and navigation and like, it's pretty like one dimensional what you support. Maybe you had like a variable width, but overall, you mostly just dealt with like browser fragmentation. So that was like, Firefox and Opera and IE and all the different versions of IE that you're trying to wrangle. And then Safari came out and then, Chrome came out. So just kind of dealing with all those and trying to smooth over the nuances between the different browsers. But then like, Safari, well, Android and iOS came out and their browsers were really limited, right? Yeah, I mean, that's where like, like you had to do like media queries, try to figure out like, what can I use here? Um,
right.
and that totally like flipped things over because now your the thing you spent like 3-4 years building now no longer works or looks very good at all, and so you have to like get into like trying to figure out snap points. That was before even there was really good like grid systems out there, so we were trying to like kind of invent that stuff, and sometimes just like hosting a brand new website altogether because like it was too far gone. You're like you almost couldn't even support your existing website because you had built like so much infrastructure around like the current layout. And that kind of pushed us towards, trying to like, move towards more REST because I mean, back in the day, especially like .NET development and some like the Django development, the marriage of your templates and your controllers and MVC controllers for at least for the back end were so tightly coupled, even though it's supposed to like be decoupled. Let's be honest, I mean, you really like did couple stuff anyway. But once you started moving to like more REST concepts and starting to like actually decouple your single page apps from your client side, kind of like that kind of discipline helped create you could have like two different versions of your website, and then as you start to move down the path, you start moving to more and more elegant front end frameworks and start moving towards like React or Angular and these types of things that make things a lot easier. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just gonna ask. I mean, I am not a front end developer,
Yeah.
but it seems like even to this day, a considerable amount of work has to happen for the different form factors, right?
For
Like
sure.
with the
Yeah.
with the mobile factor versus all of those things, and again, as a not front end engineer, I mean, obviously there's a design component. People have to do the designs differently for the different size screens. But I am surprised, I guess, and maybe it's just the reality, that it doesn't. It still seems like it's hard. It's like people put a lot of effort, into making sure that things look right and work right on the small screens, and they work right on the big browser. And obviously, then you have all of the native apps and the web views. It's just there's a proliferation now of like different form factors. I feel like that just have to be supported and have to work
Yeah.
well, and
I think especially if
it
you get
still
into
seems
like
like
more,
it's a lot of work.
yeah, especially if you get into like more interactive stuff. Like let's say you're just doing like content heavy applications, then I think it's pretty straightforward. We're usually dealing with like, I call it like CRUD applications, like lists and forms. I think that converts pretty easily. But like some of the stuff we were doing, kind of like I was like working on, was trying to get like multi-touch to work well, or to get like swipes and
Mhm.
pans. You had to code that stuff yourself. Like if I want to like have like an image gallery, and I want to be able to like zoom in on it and like swipe and swipe quickly, or have like a timeline. Like this thing at Prism I built was a kind of like swipeable timeline that had like infinite scroll and would like
Mhm.
push
Yeah.
more content as you scrolled. Like you had to figure all that out yourself, right? You've got to think about like a decay function to have the animation slow down, and what happens when you tap here and tap there, two button tap or two finger taps. And so now your form factor is like the amount of coding you have to do to like handle like the wheel versus the
Yeah, that makes sense.
like
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Mobile side gets like infinitely more complex, and you're dealing with like, different orientations and trying to make it all work together. So yeah, it can get like crazy complicated. I actually think some of the web development can actually get more complicated than some of the mobile, because the mobile, at least, it's going to just be served on like a touch display, and it's pretty much like, set in
Yeah.
stone. But for web, you've got all
I
these different possibilities. Yeah.
I I I've spent most of my career working on pretty low level systems, and I've interacted with some of the product development here and there, but doing Bitdrift is the first time that I've really been exposed on a really active basis to everything
Right.
that goes in. And again, like obviously we don't have a mobile app, we're a front end app, but it is a very visual app, and I will admit I was one of those people that just didn't. And part of it was being young and stupid, and I didn't really understand all the complexity, that would go into the front end and the mobile development. And I was definitely one of those people, that thought, how hard could it really be? And it is really, really, really hard. I mean, there's a lot of complexity there, and making those things work well is a huge challenge. And I'm saying that as a non front end mobile developer. So
Yeah.
anyway, totally agree. Sorry, let's keep
Yeah.
going. So you
Uh,
made it to San Francisco, and
Yeah, it was good. It got me down here. It was kind of an important step to like join that startup. And then, but I was actually living with a good friend of mine, was the first engineer at Uber when I moved to San Francisco. We moved in together, and kind of in the early days, I was getting a kind of a feel of what was going on at Uber. This seemed like it was like kind of the next big thing. And I was hanging out with the crowd, and I was getting some kind of insider intel, like, hey, this thing's going to be big. And so after about like a year and a bit after at this startup, I kind of made the jump to Uber. So I was there pretty early, kind of first 75 engineers or so, and
yeah,
within the first 300 at the company. And I thought when I joined, like, oh, this thing's already, maybe I'm joining a little late, like little did I know that like it would turn into a 30,000 person company. It would be, I don't know what the market cap is today, a couple hundred billion or something.
yeah,
So it was pretty cool to kind of get in early on that. And when I first joined, I actually joined as a web developer, kind of front end web, and two of us built the first kind of mobile web version. We called it Muber of Uber. And that really was like supposed to kind of open up Android and kind of like get, because there was an iOS app, but there weren't really any Android engineers at the time. And we're just trying to like get something out the door so folks that weren't on iOS could access. And then kind of one of the first things we did was like create a wrapper. It was like an Android wrapper. So when you installed the Android app, you just got a mobile web view. And that was the entire experience. It was like a login screen. I don't even think it was a login screen. I think it was just like a loading screen
I-
and then a web view. And that was
is
the
that
first, yeah.
yeah? Actually, it's interesting. Is the reason that they didn't go straight to doing an Android app, was it just really resourcing, or they couldn't find someone that would do it? I mean, it's like why
I think
didn't
it was
they
just
have someone do a native app?
I think the audience, right? I mean, Uber was for mostly like US based and a fairly wealthy clientele,
Who
pretty like,
tend to have
techie
iPhones?
type
Yeah,
people. And they're like mostly all on iOS.
right. Yeah.
But then, right when we joined, we started thinking about like international, and we had ambitions to kind of like, open
Yes.
in
Right.
Paris and Italy. And, there was all these kind of like international launches happening, and internationally Android was just much bigger. So there was kind of like a sense of urgency to get an Android app
Got it.
built. There's two other folks that were just starting to chip away at the Android app, and I kind of joined that team, and we started building the first like big like production version of the app.
Yeah, I would imagine you have some fun stories from that time
Oh
of
man, it was wild. It
trying to
was one of
make
the
that
coolest
work.
time. Yeah, it was really. The analogy is like it's being in a band, and the band like makes it big. Like you're kind of like at this thing in an office. It feel like a startup. Then suddenly it's like all the attention is on you. So yeah, it's like high pressure, high stakes. Kind of like living at the office. You just eat, breathe, sleep, code, Uber all the time. And I kind of like I was already like I think it was what my fourth company. So I had a good sense of like, this is it. Like this is, if there's ever like one time in my life I'm gonna like give it everything I've got, it's like right now, because this is like the biggest opportunity I've got. And so I was just like throwing myself at it. it was really exciting. Yeah.
And then you were there for a long time, so you must have done quite a few things
Yeah.
at Uber,
So yeah,
right?
I was there for 10 years, and like to say I kind of grew with the company. Up until that point, I'd worked at smaller companies. I was more of a startup kind of guy, and just growing with the company, because the company is growing so quick, was a serious challenge. Like just up leveling yourself constantly. At a company that scale, usually what happens is that the startup people are there, they kind of kick it off, like great, they get fantastic equity, they're happy, but there's a point where they don't fit anymore, and they start bringing in the
Yeah.
next rung of talent that they can bring in. So that'd be like, people who worked at big companies, the real pros. And it's not to like throw shade on anyone in the startup crowd, but the startup crowd tends to be maybe a little more like a multidisciplinary. They're jack of all trades. They problem solve really well, but they're not like the hardcore specialists, right? They're not like machine learning specialists or whatever. Tend to be maybe more risk takers. And you start, as a company grows, you have the people that are like more risk averse. So people are going to build you that like super detailed platform. They're going to spend 2 years building
Well,
this thing. It's going to scale perfectly. Yeah.
yeah, I was gonna say it's not shade. I mean, I've
No.
been through some of the same type of transitions, and I think it really just is different people that thrive in these different environments, and
Yeah.
it's
And
not
it gets
good
more
good or
bureaucratic as
bad.
well. Yeah.
It's just different. Anyway,
Yeah.
sorry, keep going.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think as a company gets bigger, so get a little more process heavy. You start having to do more coordinating across groups of people. You can't just like, crack your knuckles and start coding. You have to like make documents and start planning things, and that can also be such a heavy like phase shift for people that like we're just used to just coding all day, not really asking for permission to do anything, and just pushing code out, moving as fast as they could go, to suddenly now you got like, actually you can't just do that anymore, because like it's like $1 billion a day is flowing through this platform, and you just can't push code, and you got to focus on reliability, and you got to focus on quality, and you need to communicate really well across different teams, because now we've got thousands of microservices, and hundreds of mobile engineers that all need to like coordinate together, layers and layers of management. It gets, the matrix gets so much more complex, but I was determined kind of like grow with the company and learn how to become a big company guy, as I grew with the company. So, I was kind of stoked at the opportunity, even though like, it seemed like every 6 months, like everything I knew was no longer applicable, and I had to like retool completely. And that was kind of an ongoing thing. I kind of didn't slow down, for like at least for 8 years. I was
Yeah.
constantly trying to reinvent myself just to stay afloat.
Did you work on the front end side the entire time, or did you do multiple different things there?
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. After I kind of like made the switch from mobile web to just straight mobile engineering to the Android development, I really just like found a home there. For me, it was just kind of the perfect mix of like, technical work. It was the tip of the spear for the company as well, right? We're a mobile first, like logistics platform. And it was the core product. So I felt like I was really like in the hot seat. I was got to be like, at the helm of a lot of decision making and kind of product development. And I was just like right on the edge. And it's the stuff that everyone uses. I was on the Rider app. So it means like every single
Yep. Sure.
person in the world using Uber is going to be like touching my code, and I'm going to be building those features. And I thought that was just the coolest thing ever.
Uh,
To think of like hundreds of millions of people using
yeah.
the thing I built. That was so fun.
When you moved over to doing native Android app, I would imagine that there's some things that you missed from doing web. I don't know. I mean, could you talk a little
For
more
sure.
just
Yeah. I think
about just about those days in terms of because I mean, like the one that comes to mind, of course, is that when you're doing a mobile web page, or you're doing a web view, if you have a mistake, you change it in 5 minutes and push it out, and it's fixed, right? I mean,
Yeah,
obviously
I
that
think
that
I
does
think
not
just the
apply in the
velocity.
app at all. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the velocity just completely changed, because on web, one person could just get so much work done, especially like, redeploying the code locally is just so fast. And then you can just get in there like in your Chrome tools and start like tweaking your CSS values and like
Hmm.
play with the alignment. Okay, that's cool. That's perfect. Just copy those values out and dump them back in your CSS, because it's kind of, you have this live thing. And also just like all of that started to really slow down in mobile, especially at Uber, as the code base started to grow and we started to hit
Hmm.
some of like the
Yep.
like almost like limits of what the tooling would allow. And we were at this really kind of like scary inflection point where we're adding like, I think, a megabyte of compiled code a week into our code base, of compiled code. And it
A
was just like
megabyte
buckling under
of
the pressure.
compiled code a week. Wow.
Yeah. And so like even like the over the air limits for the Rider app, that's because like the App Store
Yeah.
at some
Right.
point said you can only 100 megabytes is all you can ship before we're gonna like make you plug into Wi-Fi and download this binary because it's too large, and AT&T or whatever doesn't want you to download like large files, or I don't know what the real rationale is, but trying to like preserve the network, and they kind of like started incrementing that a little bit, but the pace was completely out. Like we were going to blow through that limit, and it was almost like an existential crisis for the team because we were writing like you can just count, like we're adding a megabyte of compiled code a week. We have like 15 weeks until we're out of headroom, and we can't ship this app over the air anymore. Which is like, for a consumer company, it's like kind of a death knell. You have to make sure that like people can download your app, especially when they're like feeling like maybe they're in the rain and they just are tired of taxis and they want to get your download the Rider app.
But that's like a megabyte of compiled code and the backing assets and those kinds of things, right? Like it's not like a megabyte of instructions, is it? I mean, is that?
Yeah. No, the binary is growing by a megabyte a week. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. That's still huge. I was just
Huge.
It's like, wow, that's amazing if you were producing 1 megabyte of actual compiled machine instructions per week.
Yeah. That's everything was going in there.
Right.
And so, but also the whole tool chain was starting to really like buckle because, things like local build times, indexing. And so we were kind of having to make a lot of like tough decisions about like how we're going to be writing the code, like limiting what functions you're allowed to use, like in Swift, for example, because it compiles. Swift will actually like compile the bytecode is quite bloated, so we're trying to like try and trim down some of the kind of the fancier functions that were available in Swift. I mean, they're kind of a company-wide effort to try to scale the code base. So we learned a lot about it, scaling technologies, new build systems, how to like, modularize a code.
Yeah.
How to
Did you did you stay while you were there? Did you stay more product focused, like building features, or did you end up actually working on some of these infrastructure type things of like trying to fix the build speed or the CI or your IDE performance or those kind of things?
Yeah, so we ended up. I was kind of one of the founding engineers. It was called the Ride Experience, which is kind of the Rides product team. And then I was one of the tech leads on the team, kind of the main tech lead for mobile. And then I was doing a lot of the kind of, I guess, architectural work for the app. And I kind of made a pitch that like we should start a platform team that's like really focused on the Rider app. We had like a kind of central platform team that would work on things just like generally like providing like CI and some frameworks. We'd work really, really closely with them. But the Rider app itself was getting so big, and there was, I don't know if you know about the kind of programs and platforms model, I guess, feature teams and platform teams.
Yep.
When you have an entire organization of almost entirely like feature teams, what happens is you don't have any one of them that are really focused on how the whole thing is going to come together. And so that was kind of the team that I started to kind of move back into management. And we started working on a lot of the foundational aspects of the app so we could start scaling it. And then we also were part, there was a point where we pretty much declared bankruptcy on the code base because it just wasn't scaling and the architecture was a little bit antiquated and was our kind of first rev at the architecture. And when you add like 100 engineers that are just like flowing into one code base, you just really outgrow your assumptions very fast. And there's no amount of kind of trying to code your way out of it that'll solve the problem. At some point, you're gonna be like, we got to just stop development here, and we're gonna like completely rethink the architecture and rebuild the whole thing from the ground up. Yeah. And that was a cool moment where our team and the kind of like central platform team got together, and we had a lot of working groups, and this is where we came up with what's called RIBS. That's an open source framework, and we started moving away from things like activities and view controllers and moving more towards our own homegrown architecture to start subdividing a lot of this code and make it possible to like isolate teams and have like really strict contracts between how all these modules come together. It's basically like Viper is the design pattern, but it's loosely based off of Viper.
Yeah, I was going to say it's really interesting to me because in the back end world, obviously the solution that people use, for better or worse, is they split into microservices, and you
Yeah.
know, I mean, you can segment things that way. But in the mobile world, and really to some extent the front end development world, it's like it is one app, you know, that goes out there, and I think I mean, this is not to my knowledge. I think companies, especially big ones, are still trying to figure out what is the right way of building that almost hub and spoke model where the teams can work independently, but it gets linked together at the end of the day, and it actually works. Um, but yeah, I just think it's interesting because it's almost like the best analogy that I can come up with is I remember when I started my career, actually working on Windows. And I
Mhm.
remember back in the day, I mean, I'm not joking, you know, every night they would compile Windows and it would take like 30 hours or something
Yeah.
like that, right? I mean, to compile the whole thing, and they would produce Windows.
Yeah.
And that seems crazy to people today, you know, that like people would wait 24 hours for a build for something that they can test. But in a lot of these large mobile applications, I mean, it's like if you actually sat down and compiled everything from scratch, even with huge machines, I mean, it can take a very, very, very long time.
Hours for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, especially a release build. Yeah, those can take a long time. And then you have all your tests that you're running, and you have tens of thousands of tests that run, all the integration tests. Yeah, you for sure can take hours and hours.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what ultimately led you to leave Uber?
Um, I mean, I just been there for 10 years. I think I was ready for a
Yeah.
change, and I kind of just felt like I should take some time off and recharge. I mean, I feel like it been there, done that at some point. I mean, I loved my time there. It was really an awesome experience. I was looking for something new, and then I spent about 6 months just hanging out like here in Tahoe, and kind of retooling, figuring out what I wanted for the next position. And I got a call from SoFi actually, and it seemed like a really compelling offer, like a great company. Pretty consistently hearing people say, we want to be a top 10 financial institution, very ambitious, great CEO. And generally we want to be like a fintech super app. We're a mobile first bank. And it was an opportunity to become like the director of engineering for mobile of a mobile
Yeah.
first bank. I thought that was a pretty cool opportunity. So it was like all of my prior experience was just going to like stack perfectly for this role. And I feel like it was just the perfect fit for sure.
Yeah. I mean, I would be interested to learn more because, you know, I have worked at lots of different companies, and I obviously came from Lyft, and you know, like you can work on all these systems and you can feel, oh, you know, if someone doesn't get a ride, it's like we're going to ruin their lives or something like that. And like, yeah, it's bad, right? But it's probably not going to be the end of the day. You know, if you lose someone's money, it's probably a much bigger deal.
Mhm.
Not to mention all of the federal regulations and all of those things. I'd love to ask actually, like what it was like moving, you know, from obviously you were at Uber during very crazy times, so a lot more regulated times. But I would imagine that working on a financial product is a very different type of experience.
Yeah,
I don't
you
know. So
you
yeah,
think
like how do you
so,
feel about that?
except that we'd gone like full circle at Uber to like the full like as tech life cycle, from startup to large late stage like multinational, handling billions and billions and billions of dollars
Yeah.
in the system, and like every minute of downtime being like $1 million a minute, or I forget what it was, like the actual cost for every incident was just absolutely enormous. So one of the things I learned at Uber, we had a really, really strong posture and reliability. I mean, that was Travis's whole thing, right? Like transportation as reliable as running water. And, we went through all the growing pains of learning,
Yep.
how
For
to
sure.
scale a lot, how to go from a startup to a humongous consumer tech company with a global, a global footprint. I mean, we're like in all these different countries and dealing with all the possible outages, like, dealing with like, cellular network issues in India, for example, or China, like, so you definitely cut your teeth. So I feel like, when it came to SoFi, like I'm bringing a lot of that muscle of really ensuring that we have high reliability, and SoFi is a much younger company. And as far as the tech team, even though we're a publicly traded company, the IPO was I'd say like it was an early IPO compared to a lot of like a Stripe or something, right? They're not even public yet, and they're already a humongous company. So I think our IPO is kind of like more to the left, and so we're kind of like coming out of the startup. We're in a growth phase right now. And so they've been bringing in people who have, gone through that scaling. We have
Yeah.
lots of people coming from Amazon and Meta right now and LinkedIn and other like big tech companies so that we can build that. So a lot of that kind of best practices, I'm trying to bring those best practices and be like, hey, trust me, I've seen this before. We should probably invest in these areas. We should invest in automated testing. We should be investing in more observability. We need to like better on-call practices, and trying to like formalize that knowledge and trying to train people, and also like bring in also some folks from Uber as well, the engineers who are kind of understand that stuff. So it's just kind of the natural progression of a company when you go from startup to, big company with higher stakes, and, outages become, regulatory problems,
Absolutely. Yeah.
big reputational problems. But one thing I'd say that SoFi has, which was there before I got there, was like a really, really thorough incident management process. I think that's something that I think is best in class that we have. Like if there's an incident, we have a very well-defined procedure, and, a kind of a very well-defined way of getting out of it and
Yep.
documenting and then doing, follow-ups and postmortems and learning from our issues and making sure they don't repeat. So I think overall, like we're maturing as a company. I think we're doing a pretty good job so far.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that I'm wondering about is, you obviously did Android development super early. You were starting out when the industry itself had not evolved very much. It's like everyone was learning together around how to do mobile development. And obviously Uber is one of the biggest mobile applications, and, was kind of ahead of the curve in terms of all the problems that you were talking about, observability problems and build problems and all of those things. And what's interesting to me, and I love to get your perspective on this, is that we're in 2026. And I actually still think most of these problems for smaller companies that haven't solved them and are growing, they still exist. Like people still have build speed problems, and then they argue about whether to move to Bazel, and people still have observability problems, and people still have IDE problems and like release problems and all of those things. So I guess I'd love to ask you, what's the same that you already looked at 10 years ago, and like what is better now? What has improved in the last 10 years, I guess?
Well, what's the same is that what's more interesting about where we're at is that we're actually a Flutter shop. And
Oh,
one of the
okay.
things
Interesting.
when I would join, the Flutter rewrite was happening. It was kind of a midway done. And then
Yes.
I came in and like finished it and got it over the finish line. And so it was a bit of a scramble to get it done. But it means that like some of the kind of decisions that were made early on weren't necessarily the decisions I would have made. I probably would have come in and said, hey, let's take a little more time and think through the architecture, because I've been to battle. I can see where this is going. But what's interesting is that like we're kind of in a similar position to where Uber was back in like 2015, 16, when we were doing like the hyper scaling of the code bases. But now we're doing it with Flutter. The thing is, like at Uber, we didn't have much prior art for what happens when code bases and mobile get that big, right?
Yep.
There might have been Meta, LinkedIn, Google Maps. I mean, there's only a few like big applications out there, and they kind of like solved it their own way. That's where React came out of, right? And so
Yes. Yep.
every company was trying to figure out their own like front. I mean, Lyft had their own like Scoop, right? They're trying to like scale with their own front end scaffolding, and we're kind of hitting that point now with Flutter, where we're one of the largest Flutter apps in the world, and most Flutter applications out there are pretty small, or they're wrapping like a game engine or something, and they're just using it for like navigation and maybe your account settings, but like otherwise just Unity that's like embedded in the like a Flutter frame. That's how like Google Earth is built, right? It's a Flutter app with like a C++ kind of like rendering engine for the Earth. But as far as like large applications with like hundreds of features, hundreds of engineers, hammering on this one big code base. Like we're going to have to figure stuff out. We're actually figuring it out as we go, especially around like CI and some of our own builds and code gen. We're starting to kind of like hit some of those limits where throwing hardware at the problem is not working anymore. Like we're all on the latest M4s, and we're kind of getting the best infrastructure we can buy, all the M4 Max machines in CI. But there's a point where like the hardware is not going to get you out of this problem. You have to start like using a lot more cores and sharding your builds and start like being maybe more selective about what you build.
So what you're saying is that you're going to have to unfortunately adopt Bazel. Is that what you're actually saying?
Like a Bazel or Buck, or we might get there. I mean, I think Gradle, as they've made a lot of improvements in Gradle in the past few years. We are standing on the shoulders of a lot of the tech companies that have developed some of the technologies and practices for large like native apps. But then now we might be one of the first companies to apply it
Flutter on top. Yeah. So I guess then my takeaway from that is that in the last 10 years, we have React Native, we have Flutter. What else what else is the same and what's different for a scaling company?
What's different than the early days of Uber was that like most third-party like products and platforms for doing things like observability, like releases, experimentation, there weren't platforms available. So we had to build all that stuff ourselves and then build like the SDKs ourselves.
Yeah.
Now, though, a lot of those engineers from those companies kind of went off and started like Datadog and Optimizely, LaunchDarkly, these types of tooling companies out there. Like we use like Runway, which is like, phenomenal. And at Uber, we supported all that code too, right? We mostly were building versus buying. And now, why would you build those kinds of like kind of generic tools when you can buy them because they're so good? I mean, like Datadog is great. Runway is great. Even like GitLab and the whole CI, like the CI that they provide is just like so much better than some like, I think we were on like Build Kite or something. We were trying to like manage our own clusters, and we would have like scaling woes with that, and it was kind of constant. Our infra was always brittle and falling over, and now you just call someone and be like, hey, like we're paying for you, please get your system back online.
Yeah. No, I mean that makes sense. I mean, I think things have certainly evolved. It's just interesting to me because, and this tends to come up surprisingly or not surprisingly in every one of these podcasts that I do, is that Apple and Google, I mean, probably for not surprising reasons, they're busy. They seem to optimize for getting as many apps in the App Store as possible, right? And not that many companies make it to where they have the problems that you're talking about. But it still seems like, every company has to solve a lot of these same problems like over and over and over again. So it is nice to hear, and obviously I'm biased on the observability side, that there are vendors trying to fill the holes. I just think it's interesting, actually, that in some ways, Apple and Google have seeded a lot of these problems, like either to companies to solve for themselves or to vendors. And like, maybe that makes sense, but sometimes it seems like the platform could help some of these things work a bit better,
I think some of
I guess.
The big companies have their own homeworld stuff too, right? I mean, Google probably has, I think, their own platform.
I'm sure.
Amazon and stuff.
Sure.
They could look at basically creating enterprise versions of those that you could use. I mean, Amazon's pretty good at doing that on the back end side, like, AWS, like it's all the stuff they use, they've built, and then they kind of, turn into a paid product. There's a huge opportunity there. And, but sometimes you think that like even the big companies though, it seems like they don't always build big apps like Google, for example. I mean, it's just Google and Apple. I mean, the two big, the big Play Store and App Stores. Like Apple, I don't know if they've got like huge apps. Like
I guess that's true. You're right. Yeah.
They have a lot of small apps, and it's not like their entire business runs on that one app.
Right.
They have like 20 different apps, like a health app and all that stuff. If they try to put them all into one app, I think they would probably end up having more empathy for some of the engineering, some of their, clients that have to build these and
Yeah.
support big apps and get them up in the App Store. I mean, even just like getting App Store reviews, for example, like that's just such a pain point for us. I
Yeah.
mean, we'd love people just fast track stuff. Like, come on, like we're a big publicly traded company. Like, do we need to like have like one individual review our app constantly? I mean, at least Google like streamline that kind of stuff. Or like, can you build automation, or can we tap into some automation and just like have you just run some scripts
Yeah.
against our binary, and then you can just tell us that like we're not in compliance. But the fact is actually like a human being that sits there and like you don't know when your app's going to get reviewed is kind of it's still crazy to me.
Yeah. Just because it's a personal focus of mine for obvious reasons, I'd love to learn a little more, of how you all view your observability practice on mobile. And mostly because I think it's interesting, right? Again, as you know, I mean, in the server world, it's very well established. It's like people have invested a ton in this. You know exactly what's going on everywhere. And on mobile, I mean, at least until recent times, it's like we had good crash reporting and that's about it, And I just like, as apps and frameworks have matured, it's like crashes are less and less of a problem, and there's a lot of other usability issues. So would love to just understand, like, as you all ship features and you say that you do it at high reliability, I don't know, it's like what are some of the practices, what are the recommendations that you would have for people listening, in terms of how to actually ship high quality code, I guess, or how to
Yeah,
know if
I
you're
mean,
shipping high
if
quality
we
code.
step back and just through that question about reliability, obviously observability is a big factor, and you have to invest in it, and, or else you're flying blind. One of the practices I've been trying to bring to the company as far as like the mobile side is some of the stuff we learned about observability at Uber is like, you can have system metrics, you can have, things like crash free rates, but they don't really tell you about what's happening in your application. And even just like impressions alone don't really tell you that much. What you have to do is really have like almost like kind of like mini funnel or a flow or a span
Yep.
where
Yep.
you're connecting something happened and I expect an outcome. And for the longest time, like at Uber, for example, like we like Datadog and some of these other tools allow you to like kind of link those two metrics. So that produces like potentially two different events. And then you have to be able to connect those either client side or server side to say, okay, what's my rate? What percentage am I? Because like,
Yeah.
what's the throughput of this feature? Like if I'm expecting a user to register and then I see a success screen afterwards, that should be pretty constant through the application, and it should be resilient for when 8 a.m. in the East Coast starts to wake up and people start using your application and starts to wind down. Like that rate should be
Yep.
constant. So that's kind of some of those practices I've been trying to bring, like trying to think about user metrics. How are users experiencing the application instead of just logging, blindly and then just trying to
Yep.
count numbers. Yeah.
I mean,
So,
I think we're saying the same thing, but it's always been a personal pet peeve of mine that as an industry, we focus so much on like success rate or, like little micro metrics or something, but they're not matching what the users are actually doing. Like, are they rage quitting your application? Are they having slow loading? Are they converting at a slower rate? Like, what do they actually do? Like, what are the flows?
yeah.
And again, I admit I am extremely biased given that we make a product that's in this area,
Yeah.
but I just think that we as an industry can do so much better when to this day I still get frustrated a lot at how the apps themselves actually work. It's like, the amount of
Yeah.
times in
And
my
I
day
think a
that
lot of
they're
times,
hanging or just like doing something wrong is very frustrating.
and with big apps, right? Like, teams work on their individual features and then like not that often do they really like test what happens when multiple features interact,
Or it's
like,
impossible. I mean, there's just too many permutations. It's like you
yeah.
don't know until it's out in the field,
And adding
Yeah.
feature flags, you can do experimentation and, do like slower rollouts and try to look at, different like, like health signals.
Yeah.
You can even be looking like to the market and seeing, okay, what's out there? Like, what are people saying about my product? But the amount of permutations you can have, if you're using a lot of feature flags could be in the like millions, right? If you
Yes.
have like 1,000 feature flags and they
Yep.
could all be in different states, I mean, you've already got a million states potentially in your application.
Well,
And
and we know that people don't ever actually delete those flags, so they're there forever. And then,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then now you've got like the cyclomatic complexity of your application, which is
Yeah.
crazy. You have all these different
Yeah.
forks you possibly going down, and someone quits and they leave a flag off or on or whatever it is, and there's no cleanup. So I think that's part of that. I guess as code bases grow, there's just another humongous work stream that you have to constantly be managing. Is just the hygiene and cleanup of your code, because that affects reliability, of course, because you just don't know what you're going to get. It makes QA testing really hard. It makes even unit testing hard, because you've got all these different forks to deal with, and you have to do,
Yeah.
and like things like integration testing become even harder. And these tests become a whole thing you have to maintain now. So my saying is, more code, more problems. Yeah, the bigger and more code you have, the more people you need to hire just to maintain the code, and then the percentage of your workforce just working on maintenance can sometimes just grow and grow and grow.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's just kind of a necessary function of large code bases, unfortunately.
For sure. All right. Well, in our last little section here, would love to learn from you. What do you think is most on tap in the next 5 or 10 years? Like where do you think mobile and front end development is going to go? I mean, we already talked about how some things have changed, but some things have stayed the same in the last 10 years. So what
Yeah,
what
I
do you
mean,
think
for
will be
us,
the
though,
same and different?
I mean, it sounds a little cliche today, but like, vibe coding, AI is in pretty much every single step of our workflow already, from ideation through design, through the coding phase, with like tools like Cursor and like Claude, and then through CI as well, and then code review and kind of like, self-correcting CI. And, we haven't really explored yet things like, generative UI, can just like, describe what you want and have it be that kind of even dynamic. There's a lot of possibilities there, but I think the world is changing very, very quickly. I mean, for us, it's just daily where we're getting new tools coming our way. I mean, it's really hard to predict what's 5 to 10 years. I mean, I don't even know if there's going to be a singularity by that point, or you know,
Who
well,
knows?
robots might have taken over the world completely at that point. But I mean, if we're looking at like 1 to 2 years, there's so much exciting stuff happening on the developer productivity side for AI. I mean, it's really, really awesome. And I would love to see more of it, even for like observability, right? Like, if there's some way
Yeah.
to just
One of
spin
the
up a whole bunch of events and have an AI just like,
I,
make a guess. Like, we think things are looking good, or this user looks like they're not having an easy
yeah.
time with their application. Maybe you should help them.
Yeah, one of the things actually that we've been talking about is, could we help with an agents.md or some guidance to the agents to help the agents put the right analytic events and logs in the code that's being generated so that it's easier to actually observe once it's deployed? Because I agree with you. I mean, it's like these tools are real. I think there's a lot of hype, but they are real for sure.
Mhm.
But I think it's also true that, as you say, more code, more problems.
Yeah.
And as the code goes out, there are going to be bugs. And my concern is actually that as people know less and less about the details, and then they ship the code, especially on mobile where the cycles are so long, like, how do you know if the code is even working if you forgot to put in the feature flags, or the agent didn't do it, or you can't turn it off, or you can't
Mhm.
observe it? So I think
Yeah,
there's a lot of
you have to have
opportunity
more.
to,
I think having like agents that can just like, like scan logs and scan like user events in real time, and potentially look for anomalies and start bubbling those up, because maybe like most people only hang out on the screen for
yep,
2 seconds or 3 seconds, and suddenly we're seeing that there's little odder activity or more kind of like frustration signals happening on this screen. I feel like an agent could be really, really good at
agreed.
doing something of those things, where like crunching a lot of data and then trying to look for trends across that data. And it's something like, I mean, it might exist out there, but we haven't really like explored it personally. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you. This was a fantastic conversation. Did you have any final notes that you'd like to share?
I think it's just, the pleasure is all mine, and I'm really excited to
Yeah.
get the opportunity to talk. So thanks so much for
Yeah.
having me.
All right. Well, thank you so much. That's a wrap for this episode of Beyond the Noise, Signals, Stories, and Spicy Takes. Huge thanks to Phil for joining and sharing a story. You can find this episode and all past ones on the Bitdrift YouTube channel. And if you had fun, drop us a review, tell your friends, or yell your favorite hot take into the void. So just make sure to tag us. I'm Matt Klein, and I will see you next time.